We just went live right now. Hi everybody, welcome to the Turtle Island House of Being seminar part 2, Being in Time, where we'll be discussing chapter 6 of Being in Time. Actually, Andy, can you take the head of the table? That'd make it really easy for my swiveling. No problem. And look, Andy made it here for the first time in the flesh, same time that Sammy and Brian both tuned in from afar, from outside of Boise.
I'm avoiding them.
Yeah. And yeah, we just had to get Andy's dog Riley settled in with Axel and Henry. Axel is Brian's dog that we've been dog sitting.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, is he still alive?
Is Axel still alive, Ty?
What?
Is Axel still alive?
He looks good to me. Axel, are you kidding? Axel's rocking it, man. He and I played tug of war with the rope.
Did he eat a Banty?
My dog.
It turns out that the chickens he ate before, I found out a couple days ago, were Banties.
Okay. Oh my God, he ate Banties before.
Yeah, he loves their little hobbit feet.
He's all good. Because even when he escapes, he just comes around to hug on legs.
So far, he's not gone after the chickens.
But we found a couple spots where he'd been getting through, so I reinforced the compound. So now we're able to resist several attacks. Okay, but who knows what will attack next? So Andy brought his dog over, right? And so maybe she's a different kind of dog. Maybe she'll sweet talk the fence into stepping down for her.
She's timid. She's afraid. She'll stay in the cage. The world's too big for her.
Cool, and so I think Ty's just getting some things straightened out. Frank said he was on his way to join, and I think if I bring this right here, then I should bring it up, and then it'll probably switch to whoever's talking, hopefully.
Oh, that's cool.
So yeah, Frank's on his way. Isaiah will be late. Jacob's got to leave early. Is that right? Sammy, we cannot see you.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Yeah, my computer's webcam doesn't work. So.
Well, as long as you can see that Andy and I have matching T-shirts.
It's true.
Nice, nice.
This is the first time I've worn a T-shirt on the seminar series, actually. All right. I thought that it would be fitting, and I think we've meant to do this before. We've forgotten a few times for people to do some kind of an introduction, just kind of go around, like kind of do a check, see where people are at for a minute or two per person. I was for now just thinking like high-low or happy-crappy, however you like to call it. High-low, you just a high from your week and a low from your week, and it doesn't have to be the highest and it doesn't have to be the lowest because you might not want to share that with the group. But so I'll go first, and I'll just say that my low has been the heat, and I've been working in it a lot, and it's been fine. I drink a lot of water, but it's made it so that I just like every day at about 3 I need a nap, and it's been pretty hardcore. And then my high would be that it's been really nice though when it's not too hot, and so it's been really great out a lot of the time.
40 days.
Oh! Ty's pointing out 40 days. I made my 40-day goal to do German, to practice German for 20 minutes a day for 40 days, and I got that. So now I'm for the 80-day streak. Let's go around the circle.
Would you like a coin for that?
My name's Andy. I think I met everybody. The high for my week is, I don't know, I'm getting ready for my move to Vermont, which is pretty cool. The low for my week is definitely the heat. There's no air conditioning at my house right now, so we're trying to get that fixed. But everything else is going great.
Ty, I'm about to turn this onto your face. Oh, air conditioner in here? Mm-hmm. Ty's getting the air conditioner.
This is like way nicer than I'm used to. This is about 25 degrees when I'm below what I'm looking. Yeah.
So obviously, okay, keeping consistent. The low this week is the heat. Okay, so we're in our record hot spell part of the year now, and it's truly been the summer to remember, just like it was a winter to remember. So that's but it's Idaho, so it only lasts a minute, and it's a dry heat, right? Okay. So my high is that Andy came over tonight.
Yeah.
Okay? Instead of talking to him on the television, we get to see him in person, and I always like that. So welcome aboard, Andy.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
And then it appears as though at least the order from our screen would go Sammy, Joel, Jacob, Brian.
Okay. High of my week is that I've got to spend a couple days with my great grandmother who's turning 100 or just turned 100, and sort of document parts of her life, and that was really interesting, and I enjoyed it a lot. Low of my week is that I'm in North Dakota. I really want to go home. There's not really much here. And, I miss my routine. I didn't think I'd ever be a person who missed my routine, but I miss my routine. So, yeah.
Thank you. Oh. We lost Joel.
Well, it looks like Joel dropped out, so I can go. My low today was my low this week was definitely today. It was real muggy out, and so we don't have the super hot heat here in Michigan, but it's real muggy. So you go outside and it feels like you're in a swimming pool. And my high this week, it was me and my partner's anniversary on Sunday, so that was real exciting.
Congratulations.
Congrats.
And where are you at again that it feels like a swimming pool when you go outside?
Detroit.
Detroit, that's right. Hey, and Joel, I think your microphone's working. How about you? Everybody's just taking turns talking about saying something good from the week, something low.
Is everybody enjoying eating?
Is everybody enjoying Thai eating in the meantime? Joel, can you hear us? We will go on to Brian.
Good evening, everybody. I'm beaming in from sunny Las Vegas, Nevada. To speak of weather, it's hotter than shit. But I'm in an air-conditioned hotel. I'm down here for work. The low of the week is trying to read Heidegger while in a hotel in Las Vegas. And the high of the week is I'm going home tomorrow. I'll just say ahead of time, I'll probably be in a primary listening capacity. I got only a couple hours of sleep last night. And I read through my comprehension on this chapter versus all the others was much lower due to circumstances. But I'm glad to be here. And Ty, please stop eating. I'm missing a dinner right now, and I'm a little hungry. No, just kidding. Do what you got to do.
I thought they confiscated books when you got to Las Vegas. I thought they took them all away.
There was some things I had to go through to hide them from the...
Yeah, that's absurd. I can't believe you took Heidegger with you to Vegas.
No, there's not a bookstore within 200 miles, I bet.
It was just like the worst bachelor party ever.
Yeah, there's a lot of porn magazines and casinos. Good.
I'm sure you've been experiencing falling, tranquilizing, temptation, and the they more so than any of the
you're
rest of us.
living curiosity. You're an idle talk. You don't need this chapter.
I've been trying to...
Cutting out. Oh, man.
Right. No, it's funny because I'm surrounded by And I don't know how good my connection's going to be. I'm using hotel shitty Wi-Fi. Yeah, no, I've been observing everyone else's falling as I try to remain authentic in the presence of Sin City. It's the thing to do.
Genuinely authentic.
Genuinely authentic. Yeah, I guess that's a good qualifier.
No, that
I'm probably ingenuinely authentic here because I'm probably just arrogantly authentic around all these people. I talked to somebody, they're like, what are you doing tonight? I was like, I'm going back to read. And they're like, oh, I love reading. And they're talking about some like horror mystery they were working on. And I was like, yeah, me too. I'm going to go do that now. So yeah, that's been my week. It's been massively amazing.
Thank you. Joel, we can hear your microphone. Can you hear us? Joel?
I'm Andy.
Hello, Joel?
Yeah,
Oh, there we go. Now we can. Can you hear us? You can hear us clear now?
yeah, I was having problems with the sound.
Gotcha. Well, everyone just went through talking about a high from the week and a low from the week. If you wanted to take part in that, you're welcome to do so.
I think I'll pass on that one.
Cool. Yes, I was going to say not required. Cool. Yeah. Does anyone, have any thoughts they want to lead off with on this chapter, or anything left over from last week?
Brian stole my observation.
What was that?
Being authentic.
You're
It's hard to do that,
Oh.
especially in Las Vegas.
Or maybe it's easier.
Everybody wants you to follow the other path.
Yeah. Yeah, that's something I've been thinking about, and actually, so Andy, and anyone else who might have missed it, one of the things that I enjoyed the most out of last week was how the group, through the conversation about the weird connotations of things like falling and temptation, and, like there's sort of those Christian connotations. Who knows why he did that, or if it was on purpose? We're sure it was on purpose. And who knows the reasoning? But as a way to claim those concepts, put them to, make them make more sense for us. We were thinking of falling as leaning in or leaning on, and does anybody have any thoughts about that, or I'll embellish this?
What I kept thinking of, honestly, is a totally random association, but I couldn't stop thinking of Paradise Lost by Milton. Like, I kept seeing the word falling, and I kept thinking of it literally as in like fallen angel.
Mm-hmm.
And then I started debating with myself about whether Satan would be dasein in that context. And what that, like I don't know. The conversation between God and Satan in that story. I don't know. I kept coming back to that. And I know that it's not really how he was talking about it specifically. Like he wasn't Milton or Christian ontology, obviously. But it was definitely hard for me to break away from that. I don't know if anyone else had that problem.
I don't know that it was a problem. I think that's what he was actually trying to do, as best as language and communication can, is get you to think about whatever that is, okay? Whatever it is in your head that fallen means. And because it's you drew a conclusion out of it that at least for you represented a Milton story. Did for me too. So by the time you're 57 years old, you've been so exposed to so many things, you can't help but at that point associate it with something. But I think that goes on in the next chapter to be reconciled in such a way that you understand that's part of that set of filters that you're thrown into. It's that situation at that particular moment in time, and that's your association with it. So then you have to go with that. It's like, okay, I'm all right with that.
Yeah.
So it made good sense to me. I mean, to me, because of where I'm at in my life, it's all the crutches that you've used along the way to get to where you are. Okay.
Yeah.
I think that it's interesting to think about Heidegger and Christianity, because I believe he was raised Catholic, and despite his being an atheist, he had this really interesting relationship to Catholicism. And there's a biography of him where some biographer spent time with Heidegger, and at some point they were walking through this village or something, and they may have been I'm blanking on the term for the place where Catholics worship. But anyway, he went and touched the holy water.
Oh,
and I think
The baptism, the font.
No, at the back. No, I don't know. There's like the holy water at the back of Catholic churches. So he went and touched that, and the biographer asked him, "Why did you touch that? You're not a Christian anymore." And he said something about how there was meaning far deeper in the water than anything he could believe, or something along those lines.
Say that last part one more time.
He responded by saying that his belief didn't really matter. There was meaning far deeper in the act and in the water itself than anything he could ever believe, which is really interesting to me, because I think he was pretty, at some point, like an avowed atheist.
Well, I think that what? Sorry, was I interrupting anyone?
I was just making a side comment.
Oh, I think as far as rituals, or especially, I guess if you want to call them material rituals, that involve the body and the way you go about the world. So like the act of dipping your hand in the water before you go into the building, or like let's say the act of saying, making the sign of the cross before you eat, or whatever. I think what he might have been getting at there is that puts you, those sorts of actions put you in an orientation towards the world. And so it doesn't really matter if you believe all of the, I guess, explanations or the reasons for why you should feel obligated to do those things. But doing those things impacts the way you are, like your being in the world.
So I've got an example of what you're kind of talking about, Sammy. When I was in Ecuador, I was staying with my friend's family, and they're pretty devoutly Catholic. And they would pray as a family before every meal. I'm not religious, but I would do it with them. And I noticed that it did change the way that I thought about the meal. It changed the way that it was just this moment of kind of gratitude before the meal. It really changed how you approach it. It's not necessarily religious or spiritual, but there is, like you're talking about, a different orientation.
Yeah, I actually, for a long time, I had a hard time I actually, for a while when I wasn't even going to church anymore, I'd still make the sign of the cross and bow my head before meals. Or there was also a sort of ritual my family had. Oh, hey, Carter, can you close the door? Sorry. Hey, buddy. A ritual my family had where whenever you'd hear an ambulance, like a siren's going off, you'd say Hail Mary. And so those sorts of things were kind of hard to let go of, and I realized, well, I don't have to keep that exact interpretation or that exact action. Now when I hear sirens, I just kind of stop and take a moment and think about that person or whatever, and just sort of wish them well. And it's not because I think I'm affecting them in any way. I think it's because it's affecting my orientation in the world. Or the Japanese tradition of saying itadakimasu before you eat. It's just basically it just expresses gratitude to the food for existing and for nourishing you. Those sorts of things are important for living in the world gratefully.
The prayer, when you see, that was something my parents did too. They taught us to do it too. And like in high school, I was super rebellious. They had us. We had a big Catholic education. We all went to private Catholic school. My parents were big on that. But I was pretty rebellious in high school. And I was like, why do I have to do that? I don't even believe in God. I don't even believe in prayer. And my dad was like, it's not about you. You know, it's really not about you. You know, it's about taking a moment out of your day to just kind of take inventory about, you know, what you're grateful for, which I think is a good way to orient yourself towards the world, even if you're not religious.
See, I'd argue that those acts are religious, whether or not, like you're performing a religious action, whether or not you believe anything. Because to me, religion has much more to do with action than it has to do with anything you believe in.
It's really interesting.
Disagree with that either.
And I also was thinking about, you know, falling in terms of this as well, and the conversation that we had last week, and then I had with Sammy and Brian throughout the week, and how it's just, you know, so if we're always falling in the sense of always leaning on our being with others in solicitude through literally countless ways, and being authentic means, you know, taking a stand on something, right? You know, so maybe you lean on others for almost everything, but on something you're like, no, I'm going to do this the way that I feel I really need to do this differently. You can't, you know, it's going to be exhausting. It's going to take time and energy to habituate yourself to something that's different, divergent. And so in that sense, it's like, well, what battle are you willing to, you know, what's really worth it? What hill's worth dying on, basically? And you know, is it worth it to slap everyone that you live with in the face by not, you know, signing the cross afterwards? I mean, is that worth it for you? And for me, I don't know. That's something I have to think about more. But I know that for a lot of people, it's just not worth it. Like they would rather strike out in some other way.
It's like the king of Saudi Arabia always presenting the American president with a medal so that he has to bend over before the king can put it over his shoulder.
Oh, that's interesting.
Okay. Because otherwise the president of the United States will not bow before anyone. But in order to get a medal, he'll have to bow his head. Okay, and it's always been accepted as, okay, we're not going to argue with that one. Okay. That's okay. That's a
compromise.
Yeah.
It's pretty good.
I just want to know what the. Oh no! Please go.
No, I want to know what you want to know is.
That picture where they're all standing on that orb, I didn't know what that was, but I keep seeing it. You know, it looks like they're with Saruman, and then they always they always put Saruman into the picture.
Oh, right, that picture. Yeah. And it's like, hey, who knows what that thing does?
I don't know what that is.
It's the key to the elevator, right? You know, and it's hand recognition.
Is that true?
I don't know.
It's an Oregon energy generator.
All right, so Sammy, I think you had something real to say.
Something real. Okay, well, before we move away from authenticity and the they and blah blah blah, I guess I wanted to ask, because I've been thinking about it, can one take a path laid out for you by a particular they, like you know, something that is seen as, I can't remember which passage it was, but hold on a second, I'll find it. Something that is seen as appropriate. Okay, so yeah, it was like page 239 when he says the possible options of choice to what lies within the range of the familiar, the attainable, the respectable, that which is fitting and proper. So those sorts of things are laid out for you, right? Like it's a good thing to be a doctor. It's a good thing to do this. You should do this. You should do that. Well, is it possible to appropriate those things into a sort of authentic taking a stand? Like, does authenticity, I don't think authenticity implies difference, right? So does it merely imply awareness of where that path originates? So, you know, somebody could be like, okay, my family, you know, my dad was a doctor, my grandpa was a doctor. I should probably be, they all say I should be a doctor, or there's like this implied sort of situation where I feel like I should be a doctor. And, you know, it's always the plot line in some like movie that the angsty teen doesn't want to take the path laid out for him by his family. But what if you do? Like, and what if you're like, yeah, honestly, I'd be a really good doctor and I want to do it. Like, can that be authentic if you're aware of the other possibilities? Or let's say, like, I think a really good example of this is heterosexuality. It's like, okay, everybody's just sort of presumed to be heterosexual at birth, right? So, like, you might say most people don't, like, if they're not exposed to any other way of thinking, they're just assuming, like, well, this is my orientation that's been given to me, right? They're not even thinking about it. But if you've thought about it and then you're like, yeah, I'm definitely straight. Like, can't that be authentic? I guess is my question. Like, or would you not call it authentic? Like, would you call it something else if you sort of take something that's laid out for you by the they and, I don't know. I guess if you're making it your own, it is authentic.
My only wonder is if we're making authenticity and inauthenticity too much of a decision, rather than, because I think that so much of this is happening, like we're so easily pulled back into thinking on like the level of intelligibility and things like that within like subject-object ontology. And I think Heidegger is, like, when we're reading Heidegger, we have to continually realize that we're working underneath that level, which is something that I thought about consistently while reading this. So when it comes to something like heterosexuality, like we're always already into they, and I don't know how one is authentic about something like sexuality. Like, what does that even look like to be authentic about one's sexuality? And it seems a lot different than simply making a choice. And I can't really describe what it is.
Just a question real quick. Do you distinguish between, when you're talking about, I think you're right about what you're saying about choice, but would you replace that language of choice with like language of orientation? Like, you can orient yourself towards things?
Well, I don't know, like, no, like that. No, you're right. You're right about it's better to use language of orientation than choice. But yeah, I don't know what it means to take a stand on one's sexuality.
Well, maybe that was a bad example, but I was just trying to.
I think it's a great example.
No, I think it's a good example, and that's why, like, it's so hard to even think about what it means, like, to take a stand on something, and it's so easy to fall back into the way we typically think philosophically, in terms of like distinct categories and choosing between distinct categories, but I feel like it's something lower and deeper, which is something I kept thinking throughout this chapter, because there was all these times where I'm like, no, he's wrong, but then I'm like, well, he's not asking the question you're thinking he's asking, and he's not saying what it sounds like he's saying. He's talking about something even lower, or maybe higher, depending on whether, I guess, he's a transcendental thinker or an immanent thinker. But I don't know. It's so hard to keep pushing back against how we typically want to think about things philosophically.
See, well, I didn't perceive it as that difficult. I guess the question. I just want to. For me, it was more of a question of language. Like, is it appropriate to say that if one takes a stand on something that has been laid out for you by the they, is it authentic because it is relating it to yourself, right? And I don't see how anything other than the language of choice really could work there, because to take a stand seems to imply like awareness of what you're doing in a sense, which implies agency.
I would like to think of it as like probably that they're ranging from saying, you know, I'm going to drive the speed limit as one does, but for my own reasons, to these deeper questions of orientation that might be beyond, for some people, beyond any conscious willing. He leaves it open, so I would say that it could be, you know, there could be a spectrum here of conscious to unconscious taking a stand. But that, you know, so spoiler alert, in chapter 1 next week of Division 2, a lot of this is going to be about, I mean, you don't just take a stand. You take the way to take a resolute stand on your being is through an understanding of your own most potentiality for being, which is death. And so the whole time this conversation is happening, I'm thinking about that, and it's like, well, you know, that's not necessarily like thinking, oh my God, I'm going to die someday. It can be more of just a sense of, I don't have long here, you know, I don't have time for this crap, you know, I don't have time to be a doctor. I have to be doing, you know, puppets, or, you know, being a puppeteer. Like, that's what I always felt called, you know, I only have time to do that, really. So it could be more of a sense of like the dread of just like, I don't have time for this. And do you like my example?
I do. That's a great example.
But yeah, puppet surgery, Dad. That's what I want to do. I want to be Geppetto. But you know, hey, that guy was authentic, I think. But anyway, that's what I'm thinking about. It's like that also, you know, you can gain a sense of your finitude or mortality without like a philosophical conscious sort of exercise. For instance, you almost get hit in traffic and then you adopt a new reason for driving the speed limit, right?
Oh yeah. Yeah, like after my best friend got hit by a drunk driver and got a really bad concussion, I started being like so much more aware. Like, you know, if people are at a party and they're a little buzzed and wanted to drive, I'd kind of be like, no, that's really not a good idea. And I'm going to definitely enforce this for people around me. But it would be like doing that for yourself. So being like, oh yeah, I got hit by someone who's speeding. That's my new reason. Or, like, yeah, because I other people have mortality. I have mortality and I want to live. I've got other things to do, you know, so.
Or Pinocchio, right? Like, he wants to be a real boy. But that's more than just flesh and blood, right? That's the ability to die, right? So
yeah.
Little boys die. You know, like,
yeah.
I don't know if that's too grim, but
no, that was the realization.
Like, yeah, like that's the whole point of the going back to
bit, right?
Yeah, Dave's puppet example.
Oh, this is a wonderful example, actually.
Yeah, it's a really good example. No, it's great. Your puppet wants to be an authentic human being, wants to be an authentic boy, but that means embracing mortality, the possibility
and it means
die.
Breaking from the herd because they were making him a jackass, right? Because he was running with the they and falling into the traps and the temptation that comes with that.
Yeah, so being a real boy isn't doing what all the other real boys are doing. It's kind of rising above that they mentality. That's kind of in that
there's also an interesting element there, because on page 240, when he's talking about like addictions and stuff, that second paragraph there, he's talking about the urge to live. and then he uses the phrase "towards this at any price." And I was thinking about the sort of like, I need to like that, how it's almost a pathology to want to live at any price. Well, it is, because it's like, well, would you keep yourself alive? Would you commit an atrocious crime to stay alive? That's not being a real boy, or like that's not necessarily responding to, I guess. So it's like there's this connection between the for the sake of which of your life and your values, right? Whatever they are, or what you need to do. And you know, in the Pinocchio example, it was, he realized he loves Geppetto, right? He loves his father, and he would rather express love, he would rather adhere to that value and just show his love than continue to survive. And that is actually what made him authentic, let's say. So it's not exactly that, I don't know, that's kind of a nuanced element here, but it's definitely something I wanted to tease out.
That definitely, I think the one problem with the Pinocchio example is I think it might risk falling into the trap that you were talking about earlier about choice, and kind of falling back into that language of choice and choosing to be authentic.
Yeah,
maybe.
It seems like you could meditate on the possibility of no more possibilities as a sort of philosophical exercise and incrementally gain some semblance of authenticity, but that it wouldn't be as real as losing a close friend or family member or having a near-death experience, right? So it does seem like if there is such a thing as choice here, then it might not be the deepest level. And also that, it's just interesting too, because this is something I've never thought about, was like the extent to which it is the conscious choice is really interesting, especially seeing as Sartre, that's really where he runs with this.
That's why I like the sexuality example, because you don't talk about, I mean, I guess we do talk about a sexual preference, but most of the time we talk about a sexual orientation, right? Like we talk about it as a mode of being, right? At least, I mean, maybe we don't, but that's kind of how I think of it.
Well, and the interesting thing there is, okay, and so instead of thinking of it as a rational choice, right, that you've deliberated over and you've made a few pie charts and you've been like, yep, this is good, I'm going to do it. It's more like you're responding to something that is pulling or at you or calling you, right? So it's I don't know if we'll get into this later with the call of conscience, because I don't know what the call of conscience means for Heidegger. I just know he uses that terminology. But essentially it's that like there's something there, regardless of his language. It's just like there's something there, and you're finally choosing to respond to it instead of falling into the leaning against the they and being tranquilized, right? And I think that's where anxiety comes in, because you know, dasein flees in the face of itself, right? And what you flee in the face of and what you seek to be tranquilized from, that is what you're being called towards, almost, or what is inevitable for you, unless you continually, well, with death it's always inevitable, right? But like let's say you have this sort of orientation that can't really be changed, whether it's sexual or it's like towards a profession, and if you the more you flee from it, and the more you lean on the tranquilization of other paths or of distractions, right, the more it reveals itself to you as that which you should be doing, or what you should face, at least. I guess I don't know if that's all right, but
it sounds pretty plausible. It sounds like that's like the phenomenon you are talking about is similar, if not same, to what Heidegger is talking about when he talks about the call of conscience, and that whether, yeah, maybe he'll stipulate it a bit differently, but yeah, we're talking about the same kind of thing, that this is not rightness. But this is not rightness is also the anxiety, right? The anxiety is the precursor, as far as him writing this text goes, to talking about the conscience thing, I think.
Yeah.
What's the difference between anxiety and fear?
Oh, I marked that section up so much, but I'll let someone else talk.
Anxiety doesn't have to have an object.
Anxiety doesn't have to have an object. Right.
Obviously, you had that question asked of you several times. You just popped that one right out.
Well, this is kind of a shot in the dark, but is anxiety more primordial?
More than what? Than fear?
Than fear.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it is.
He said you couldn't fear if you weren't anxious already, as like an as an existential. The existential is on the basis of which one can fear. Which would be like, imagine any of the things that you might fear in the real world, being some, ultimately there's the existentiality of that fear. Like there's some possibility of death insinuated in being afraid of snakes.
Well,
it's a really easy example, at least.
Well, okay, so yeah, directly on page 230, he says that the turning away of falling is grounded rather in anxiety, which is in turn what first makes fear possible. And if you think about it, it's almost like the anxiety he's talking about is our state of vulnerability. And he doesn't say that. And I know I'm kind of extrapolating here, but that in the face of which one is anxious is being in the world. Like, anxiety is a response to being, to being alive. And that's because we live in a sort of state of precariousness, and death is a real, like, the possibility of all possibilities or whatever. And so, yeah, there's no real object for anxiety. But we have real fears because if you're afraid of snakes, or if you're afraid of, let's say, serial killers, well, why are you afraid of them? Because they bring, they sort of instantiate that basic anxiety about your vulnerability, and they like make it something concrete, I
think that makes a lot of sense. Is that your Doge?
I don't know. I hope not.
One of the does.
If it is, that's a completely new sound that he's never made before. So
that was all of it.
I don't know. I think one of the I don't know. Never mind.
So, and yeah, just, I'm sure everyone's caught on to this as just a general rule of thumb, but he's not using anxiety in the typical sense we use anxiety, right? And I don't know how much I'm bringing in the next chapter by characterizing it as being about death, or as Sammy was getting at, the possibility of no more possibilities, right?
Or the possibility of too many possibilities. Like, I feel like that's the inverse, but also equal, right? Like, the fact that there are infinite possibilities creates that responsibility that's like almost overwhelming. You know what I mean? Because,
totally.
I don't know. And then that manifests as like, in its most shallow level, it manifests as that tendency to compare yourself to people you see on Facebook. You're just like, you know what I mean? That anxiety.
It predates Facebook, though.
Does it? Yeah. Is that just social anxiety?
That existed before
high school anxiety.
That's high school, high school reunions. Yeah.
Oh, I'm having a heart attack. You're too young to have a heart attack.
But you see other people, and their actions and decisions make you think about the possibilities of your life and whether or not you're living up to those possibilities, and that so there's this weird situation where you feel like death is like kind of coming ever closer, but at the same time you're like, I have so many options. What do I choose? You know, like I don't know.
I actually think that's an excellent point. That never mind. I'm not going to use that word, but that it goes along with the fear for. Well, okay, no, it's just a basic fact of our temporality, right? We know that sometime in our lives, and we don't know when, it's indefinite, that death is inevitable. And so that implies we have a limited amount of time, and then there's all of these things you could do. There's so many things, and then you have a limited time to do some things, and you don't really know what to do. Like, what is the best thing to do? It's a paralyzing question. And so it's so easy, and we all do it. Like, nobody's above falling on the paths laid out by the they. Like, even just going to college is doing that. Like, because what do you do next? After high school? Well, here's a guidebook. These are the choices you have to make. And some of the things, like people, it's almost like people are making sort of a must-see list for life. It's like, okay, well, you should do this, and that, and you should have a pretty full life. And so you can kind of just fall back on that, and it eases some of that anxiety.
Or those people, I'm sure you all have at least one friend who like puts themselves on a track, and it's like, by 30, I'll be married. By 35, I'll have kids. By 37, I'll be at this particular stage in my career. And it's like a sequential, you know what I mean? But it's not really something they're interested in. It's more of an attempt to kind of manage that anxiety. Yeah. Right? It's like, in front of all those possible options. I've got my whole life planned out in front of me.
Mm-hmm.
Until they're like, 29, they're like, oh man, I didn't make a baby yet. I don't even know who I'm going to do that with.
I 10 kids by that point.
Yeah.
More like my parents.
And apparently, the only thing that I can add to this is apparently it hits us in our teenage awareness. We call it teenage angst to this day. And it's each generation has a different set of labels that they put on it, but it's still the same realization. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I think it actually happens twice. It's teenage angst, and then it happens again in
midlife crisis. Yeah.
But it's that same that anxiety surfacing.
So and now I know that Heidegger would say that the most primordial one of these here is still that possibility, that hovering. I think he says it's hovering. That ever present yet not present possibility of no more possibilities is what brings those possibilities to light that then overcome us because there's too many to choose from. But then just to feed into that though, like this is in existentialism as a humanism, what Sartre talks about as dread. Coupled with anxiety comes dread, and the dread is the fact that you ultimately have to choose, and you will always be the one who chose, and you will always know that even in not choosing, you still chose, and that even when, and that there is no Kantian formula for what you should have done or should do with a lot of things, at least the really important ones. He uses the example of fighting on the front. I think I mentioned this last week. Fighting on the front with your comrades versus taking care of your mother who will die without you, right? And so the dread there is exactly what we're talking about. I think it's the fact that at the end of the day though, you're gonna have to choose, and someone might tell you this and someone might tell you that. Whoever you go to for advice though, you probably know that you're helping them push you in one direction.
That's what Sartre says.
Yeah. He says if you go to the priest,
go to a priest, you're gonna get some religious advice.
You go to the pub, you're gonna go to the front.
I always think of that before I consult my dad about anything. I already know what he's gonna say.
and maybe that it'll push you the other way.
Yeah.
Thanks, Dad. Now I know.
Right, but it's nice to be able to, I don't know, that's another anxiety management technique. It's one I do is like, collecting advice from literally everyone you can think of, just so you can have like all these different perspectives, and then usually choosing to do something none of them told you to do, but you just wanted to, like, you know. It alleviates the dread a little bit. I wanted to bring up the really interesting language of uncanniness, or the German word is unheimlich, which is not unhomelike, right?
What page?
233.
So just as kind of a side note, Sammy, when I was reading this path, I woke up this morning and I felt a lot of anxiety about all the things I have to do for my move to Vermont. And then I started rereading this passage on anxiety and totally was like thinking, I was trying to figure out why I was anxious. And then I got to the part about uncanniness and how it was unhomelike. And I was like, that's exactly what I'm worried about. Leaving my home.
Yeah, no, honestly, I marked that page, those couple pages up so much. It's better than like almost any psychological article or evaluation I've read. Like if there's a you have a so like you have a person with generalized anxiety disorder, it's like, yeah, anxiety is generalized. Like maybe that person just picks up on it a bit more. Like it just makes you feel not crazy. Pretty cool. Anyways.
Andy and Ty. First Ty went out, and then Andy went out, and they both went out because Andy's dog has been howling, making a noise he's never heard it make, kind of outside the window here on the side of the house, and it's the most sad sound you'll ever hear. So, so he said he's gonna try to figure out what's going on over there. But anyway. Does this all just seem too straightforward? Are we just so comfortable with the language developed so far that when we finally get to anxiety, it's like, yeah, that makes sense?
Well, there's different aspects of anxiety that he explores on 235.
I was just looking at.
I lined them up as like I kind of made this. I wish I had my camera. Whatever. Anxiety as a state of mind aligns with is a way of being in the world. Anxieties anxieties in the face of which is thrownness. And
psychosis.
And anxieties about is our potentiality, our utmost potentiality.
Cool.
So maybe we could explore those a little bit.
Can you now that Ty and Annie got back and I couldn't hear part of it, could you just kind of restate the way that you broke on the different kinds of anxiety up?
So anxiety as a state of mind is a way of being in the world. Anxieties in the face of which, imagine all the hyphens in there. So I guess anxiety's object, well, I don't know. No, it's really interesting because there's the in the face of which, and then there's the about. And the in the face of which is thrownness, one's thrownness into the world, and then anxiety's about is our utmost potentiality. So I'm not really.
Where are we looking?
I'm not really. 235.
Where on 235? I keep.
It's under section 41. Dasein's being as care.
Oh, okay.
Towards the bottom.
Oh.
But I guess it would make sense if anxiety kind of, well, obviously it's sort of a mode of care almost. So what we care about, what we are anxious about is our potentiality, but we're anxious because of our thrownness in the world, I guess is a good way of lining that up.
Right. I've been thinking about not as like care and anxiety as two sides of the same phenomena or coin, like, so you know, we turn away in the face of that object, you know, objectless object, that, you know, that's what the anxiety is fixating on, is something that's not present. And so you're turning away, you're fleeing, and then that's where the absorption in the world comes in the first place. And that's like the impetus to care in the first place, is how I've been thinking of it, at least.
I've been thinking of the fleeing as that track model.
Fleeing?
Yeah. Like you put yourself on that track, that train track, and, you know, as far away from the anxiety as possible.
I also, I mean, yeah, so it's like, all deadlines are lit up by that anxiety. Like you know, if you were going to live to be 1 million years old, you probably would not be doing what you're doing right now. And so any sort of a sense of needing to do things that you're doing now, like for instance, getting a degree now, well, why not just take some time off and then get your degree? Well, you've got this limited frame of time to do it. So like deadlines are all kind of riding off of the ultimate deadline.
Have you ever read, has anyone read Ray Kurzweil, the futurist, the singularian? He knows what I'm talking about.
Things that can heal death or something, or heal aging.
Synthesizer. You're talking about the guy that developed all of that early digital technology.
He did, yeah, he did. He's an inventor. Yeah, he did. He did a lot of voice work for computers, like helping them transcribe voice and stuff.
He developed technology for sampling.
Yeah. Yeah, but he has this idea of the singularity. Is everyone familiar with the singularity? The idea that technology evolves exponentially and it will eventually reach a point after which nothing can really be known, right? So his kind of idea is that we can eventually reach a point where technology will like banish any conception of death, right? And I was like reading this book that he wrote where he's really excited about this idea, right? Like he writes that he takes like 200 supplements a day and has his body and like he really does like want to use technology to extend his life as much as possible. And I was trying to figure out like what the world would look like if you banished death, if you just completely got rid of death. No one would have any reason to reconcile ever. You would just hold a grudge for all eternity because that person would always be there. So you'd have a fight with someone, you'd literally never see that person again, right? Or at least, I mean,
Or you'd have eternity to plan your revenge.
Or eternity to plan your revenge. You'd have infinite boredom. You'd have, I feel like there'd be a certain point at which art would no longer progress. Like it would just become increasingly fast streams of data. You know, like, I don't know, I was just trying to figure out where would meaning come from in a world without death? And it was hard.
Assuming we don't get a perpetual motion device, assuming we don't get perpetual energy that's self-sustaining and maintaining, then we'll have to be extracting that from other planets and just from, I don't know, the reaches of space. And therefore, to maintain that singularity for, eternity means an eternity of conquest.
Mm-hmm.
So
he's got it all planned out in his book. He blueprints like how we're going to turn stars into giant generators and how like he has a solution, a technological solution for everything. And he's very smart. Like he's a smart guy. And it was frightening reading his book because I was reading his book and I was like, I don't want to live in this world. But people like him have way more say in what the world is actually like than people like me. You know,
do you not want to live in it because of the perceived difficulty or possibility of having some kind of existential meaning?
I think so, yeah, and also because there's certain people I just don't want to live forever.
Well, and also, I mean,
like
if I
straight
live
up.
in that world, I'm like, could we still commit suicide? Like, I'd want to be able to commit suicide because, like, at some point, yeah, I do want to make an exit. It's like,
and like honestly, this really like. I lost some sleep over this because it was really frightening. It caused a lot of anxiety. And then I read that Isaac Asimov short story about the end of the universe. Did anyone, you know what I'm talking about? Where they keep asking the computer, well, can we delay entropy? Can we delay entropy? Yeah, that made me feel a lot better. Because I realized even if we do postpone death, eventually we're going to run out of suns. So,
I don't know. Deleuze thinks that he's figured out why the idea of entropy is a fallacy. So I don't know the math to be able to say whether it's true or not. Jacob?
Fingers crossed he's right.
When Deleuze starts using math, I stop paying attention because I have no idea. I have no idea what any of it means. When he talks about number theory, I get it a little bit, but when he starts talking about like math, just like mathematics, it's crazy, and I am not a mathematician.
And by the way, this is just, I ran into this a while ago, but you're saying this reminded me. He actually Kurzweil has an interesting, I mean, you can read the book, The Singularity is Near, but he actually has, you can go on to YouTube, and he has an interesting little discussion, you know, of the singularity, and it, yeah, I'm with you. It's fascinating and horrifying all at the same time.
I mean, some of the technology that he outlines as like being possible within 20 or 40 years is like truly terrifying. Like it has, you know, and then I went back and I looked up his old books to see how many predictions in his old books were correct, and like a frightening number of them are. So it's kind of, you know, like I was just like, I don't know. Is that weird?
I think it's like this weird understanding of, okay, so that made me think of that urge to be alive, like no holds barred, you'll do anything to stay alive sort of attitude, right? And I think it just fundamentally misunderstands what aliveness or what being is. And like if you don't, so the idea of having a forsake of which, you know, a purpose or meaning to your life, there's like this notion, and then I don't know like how much of this would be found in Heidegger, but like there's a sort of a notion of sacrifice that's involved where, you know, like things die and they rot and we have soil and then new stuff grows out of that. Like it's a very simple example. Or, you know, like you have children because you know you're going to die, and then that's like a new perspective on the world. So there's sort of like a circular motion as far as how, like the way of being of not only humans, but of, you know, plants and animals and even like solar systems. Like everything has a sort of non-linear character in a sense, and this strange obsession with linear time it just seems to me like a fallacy. So Andy, I just don't think you have much to worry about. I don't think that we're going to actually achieve that because it's just so fundamentally divorced from reality.
His prediction is 2045.
Right. Well, and the thing is that, you know, it's kind of contingent on human beings developing a technology to basically create new containers for consciousness and new ways of perpetuating consciousness. And then once you're no longer, you know, dependent on meat, you know, then look for the stars, you know.
Yeah, but they have. Oh, sorry.
Well, my question is a very interesting one, though. I think Heidegger, you know, and talking about, you know, dasein and so on, it's you know, and the sort of hiddenness of it, you know, our being, you know, it's sort of, to me, it brings up the question, you know, is what makes human beings human, you know, simply their consciousness or the modality of their consciousness. You know, when I hear things like this, that the other thing that makes me wonder, it's like, well, really, is there dasein anymore? I mean, is there humanity anymore? Because all of this talk about, anxiety and dasein, struggling to recognize possibilities and all of that. It kind of makes all of those questions meaningless, and without those kind of structural limitations, without the kind of contingencies that we experience now as incarnate human beings and so on. To me, talking about dasein only makes sense in when our existence is informed by and bounded by and limited by those things that we're impermanent and that we're contingent and we're limited in some ways that are, for now, kind of fundamentally part of our thrownness, right?
Right.
Because part of the situation that we've been thrown into is we're limited in the way that human beings are limited.
Right.
Well, I just wanted to say though that like the whole idea of transferring consciousness to other vessels or containers they call it the hard problem of consciousness, and it is the hard problem because it's not one that anyone's going to solve. Like ultimately they're relying on a philosophical error in trying to figure out where consciousness is located or how to simulate it or how to transfer it, because it's not something you can transfer to different vehicles. That's like this duality left over from Christian theology, and Heidegger is not debunking, but he's exposing the failure of that way of thinking about the subject. And so I think if you got most of those people who are on the singularity bandwagon to read and understand being in time, they probably realize what they're doing is not even possible. I'd hope.
Well, I think they would argue that if consciousness exists in meat, which is matter, it can just as well exist in something else. So why feel like you're limited in that fashion?
And I was kind of what you're discussing with limits, specifically that word limits is something that I think about a lot, because there is this running idea in his book that the definition of humanity, like humans' modus operandi or whatever, however you say that phrase,
Right.
is to overcome limits. Like, so the most human thing we can do is overcome the limits that have been imposed on us. But I was like thinking about it while I was reading this, and David Foster Wallace has kind of a critique of this idea, right? Like the idea that we should just have unlimited freedom, because if you think about it, any time in our society where we've like used technology, for example, to remove limits, right? What we've really done is create an incentive to engage in the type of curiosity and idle talk that Heidegger critiques, right? I think social media is a phenomenal example of this. We've removed all of the obstacles that prevent people from being connected, which is why they're constantly, which you get nothing out of, right? Like, so it's like you've removed all of these limits to communication, and as a result, communication is like kind of shitty.
This is like Mark Zuckerberg's, his charity, and it said that our goal is to make people happier. We will do that by making things faster and making people even more connected. And I was reading that and I was like, I'll shoot my head off. Like, if you keep that up, man, like, you stop. That's not going to make me happier. The fact that I already feel obligated to have a Facebook a lot of the time to keep certain people in my life brings enough suffering.
Well, this is the thing is this is all very transitional, right? The next part is not out here. It's got to be all plugged directly into our nervous system.
Well,
we'll have to go and get our Apple plug-in update every.
At a far more user-friendly format, but it was the same idea. Was the human element in the it was right on the tip of my tongue there. The movie about the little trash robot.
Wally.
Wally,
Yeah.
okay? That's a human element. All they did was hover around, drink soda pop, and yak on the phone.
Yep.
That's all they did. They get fatter and fatter and fatter and fatter and fatter. You know, the other horrifying version of it is plug in like the Matrix, right? You know, where you don't know what reality is unless you unplug.
Oh, speaking of the Matrix, there's this part that made me think of the Matrix really hard. And okay, hold on, I'll find it. Damn it. Basically, he was talking about, and I just loved all of the stuff about how, I mean, he really goes a little farther than I would have, but in I mean, sort of combating this, like when he says the scandal of philosophy is not that we don't have these proofs, it's that people are demanding these proofs. I mean, I love that, but like there's okay, here it is, page 250. He says to have faith in the reality of the external world, whether rightly or wrongly, to prove this reality for it, whether adequately and inadequately, blah, blah, blah. Attempts such as these, which have not mastered their own basis with full transparency, presuppose a subject which is proximately worldless or unsure of its world, and which must at bottom first assure itself of a world. And what that made me think of is maybe part of the reason that all these questions started cropping up and becoming like obsessions in contemporary philosophy or even modern philosophy is because of alienation from and the rapidly increasing speed of technological development, right? And so there's a sense of not being sure of the world and being alienated from it. And the more we get absorbed in virtual realities or think of them as possible, I mean, like the question, that whole exercise of the brain in the vat, you know, the simulation or the, oh, is all reality a video game question? It's like, you couldn't ask that if video games didn't exist. Those preceded your dumbass question because like.
But no, you could use Heidegger's very reasoning though and say that the fact that video games exist is because of the existential possibility for video games' existence, and that's because we are all in a video game.
Well, and I would argue too, the whole.
I don't think he would say that.
The philosophical question though of appearance versus reality though is long preceded any of our sort of contemporary acts of creating, you know, virtual things, whether they're video games.
It was magic at one point.
Right. You know, you know, in the past, right, it had to do with, you know, magic or something.
Could it be an evil demon?
Fairies.
Right.
Demons,
I mean, that was Descartes, you know, or even much earlier, you know, and even Plato, you know, he talks about, you know, this capacity, you know, they had this idea of, you know, maybe, you know, the gods is messing with, you know, is messing with your mind.
Right.
You know, but there was always the, you know, a recognition that at any one point in our existence, there is no way for us to sort of categorically and objectively answer that question, which is why it's so, which is, you know, why it's anxiety producing.
And I think that the one thing that we didn't get, and I want to say it was, I don't know, but it was the very end of anxiety before it started reality and care, is the significance of disclosure as the last, not the last piece, but a final discussion point on anxiety, was that anxiety is unique in that it has this disclosure element to it, which is, you know, we don't really, we hate talking about it. And disclosure is, what if they find out I'm not who I am? Okay. What if my authentic dasein that's out there is not really the authentic dasein that I think it is? You know, what if I'm just a poser? And you have that at your core. You know, what if I'm not meant to be an architect? I'm not meant to be a father. I'm not meant to be any of the things that you are at that current moment in time or are thinking about down the road. And it's just this anxiety because you have this doubt inside of yourself.
Well, and when we find ourselves struggling with those things or failing at those things, yeah, it makes it really present.
I mean, lawyers feed on that, especially during depositions. I'd never really gone through that until I had to go through some depositions, and it was on video camera. I began to have to disclose everything about my life from grade school on forward, to prove that I was in fact the person that I said I was, and I could make the decision that they said I made, and it was terrifying.
I think the authenticity is one thing.
I have a quick question. Are you possibly confusing fear and anxiety? Right, because this fear has a discrete object in the world that you fear, and this is going to include something like a status that I have as a person, right? So when I think of like for example, like a test, in terms of like me succeeding at something, right? I fear, this test that like you were talking about lawyers or something like that they feed on, right? This seems to be more like fear than anxiety, whereas anxiety seems to be something much more untangible and something about the very structure of your world in terms of how you're made up, how you're constituted in that way, in that fundamental way, right? And so I'm just asking for that clarification.
Yeah, I would emphatically say no. I know what fear is, and anxiety is different than fear.
Well, I think you could ground this in this in the kind of anxiety we're talking about, pretty easily by being like, well, this form of disclosure, which I'm not sure it's exactly the same thing, but like it's a form of it, right? This form of disclosure where you're having to give this account for yourself to these sort of, I don't know, they're not objective, they're hostile, lines of questioning. Have you calling your own life into question, and whether or not you've done the right thing in just even the normal choices you've made, being a father, for instance. It's like, well, so it was like an existential crisis. And I'm saying that kind of existential crisis would be grounded on the kind of anxiety that we're talking about. It's and these kinds of disclosure are grounded in the kind of disclosure that Dasein does as a world disclosing being. I wanted to say a thing about maybe we shouldn't go back to it. Let's see what time it is. So it's like 8. I just want to say I feel like there's a Heideggerian response to the court. What's his name? Kurzweil. And there's a Heideggerian response to it, and I've heard it, I've seen it, so I might as well bring it up. And there's a philosopher who I forget what his name is. He lives in England. I don't know if he's from there, but he argues that contemporary science is really just a form of Gnosticism, that everything about it is about exactly that, fear of death, and that and he has kind of his own. He has a book on that, and there's basically they reduced his entire book to a checkmate like kind of sentence, which I don't know if it does the book justice, but the basic idea is because existential death is not the passing of the body, the rotting of the flesh. We'll get into that in the next chapter. Because the death we're talking about is the possibility of no more possibilities, you'll never be able to eliminate that existential death. Even if you could say that we've been alive for 10,000 years, no humans have died in 10,000 years, not even by accident. The possibility of no more possibilities, something that as long as they're anything like humans now, anything like Dasein, then that possibility is not something we're going to be able to make ourselves forget. And that, the very idea of fleeing, fleeing includes curiosity, ambiguity, and idle talk. Fleeing is the motivation, the absorption in the day that drives the curiosity to just be kind of going from one thing to the next thing. Novel attraction, bring it. Because we're trying to keep that possibility like off the periphery. And so if anything, it would just kind of drive that harder. It would just drive the falling harder. And I'm not saying I believe that. I'm saying it makes enough sense, but at the same time, as far as like being able to make definitive, yeah. For instance, I'm tempted to say that if they understood being in time, maybe they wouldn't. Maybe they just drop the whole project. I actually don't know though, and it's interesting because I don't. Like I said, this AI is hard.
I don't know. Reading his book made me feel like, I don't know if he's read Heidegger. It made me feel like he's pretty aware of a lot of the standard arguments that are philosophically based and made against his kind of line of thinking. I mean, he's got a whole singularitarianism. He's got a whole philosophy that he's advocating and trying to defend against counterattacks. And the last half of his book is actually devoted to responding to various philosophical critiques of the singularity. So I don't know, but I think that's a good answer.
Isaiah brought up. Oh, sorry. Isaiah brought up in the chat that he apparently, I don't know what your sources are, Isaiah, but that he's apparently obsessed with reviving his father, and he wants to make like a father simulator, and he kept all his letters from his father in order to program them.
Oh yeah, no, he has some seriously. I mean, it's clear that the death of his father like really impacted him and completely. Yeah, he keeps biological samples of his father because he wants to recreate him. Yeah, he definitely is trying to develop technology to bring his father back from the dead. You know, I don't know.
Yeah.
So,
sorry.
Oh no, Isaiah, please go.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say regarding your comment, I think that's pretty spot on. I think he would say something like, I mean, we don't actually ever experience our death, right? Death is not something we actually undergo because you're dead, right? So death is always going to be something like prior in some way. Like what he means by death, Heidegger, is going to be something prior to death in that sort of like final material sense, right? So I don't think you can ever eliminate that, right? As long as we're dasein, right? Maybe if we transcend into some other new species or something, right? And we're no longer dasein, then yeah, sure, that we might have to talk about a different argument. But as long as we're dasein in this fundamental structural sense, right, which I don't think, at least for now, we're ever going to surpass, then we're always going to have to worry about that possibility. It's not something you can just eliminate, right? So even if we transfer our consciousness to something else, there's always going to be that possibility of dying in that final sense, of experiencing that. And we're just going to be in the mode of falling in that way, always evading our death, right? Always evading, right? Postponing thinking about these issues, right? About the possibility of me no longer being possible, right? Which is something you just can't eliminate. When you cash it out in those terms, then it's no longer this material sense which we usually take, right? And I think it's an appropriate response to someone that's like going to argue this. I'm going to biologically elongate my life till infinity.
And actually, I think that, you just made me realize, so if the fundamental, the very fundamental building block of the Cartesian ontology is I think, therefore I am, then the Heidegger, so that because we get there by asking the solipsistic question and using the hyperbolic doubt to say, could the world not be real? Could I be in a dream? Could I be in the matrix? We ask all these questions, but then at the end of the day, you're like, but I know that that's the case. I think, therefore I am. And then from there, you can build up, your certitude of other things. And this way of this Google way of thinking is predicated on that idea. Well, as long as I'm thinking, I am. But then Heidegger's whole thing is like, yeah, but what's that am anyway? And then his whole project, if we really were to boil it down, is going to be like on the care anxiety phenomena that is, what brings that into being in the first place is that possibility of no more possibilities. So I guess there's something I want to articulate about this that I'm not quite sure how to do it just yet, but I'm going to probably want to sit and write about it for a little bit because it's like.
the implication to me is kind of like, I think therefore I am, but in the kind of like Kurzweilian philosophy, whatever. I think therefore I am. If I think faster, I'll be more. It doesn't actually matter what the am is. Because I'll have more of it, and I'll never run out, ever.
Jacob mentioned.
Especially when I'm powered by a star.
The screaming star.
Jacob mentioned in the chat the thinker Virilio, and I was just looking through some of his books on Amazon. And yeah, he has a book called Speed and Politics, and he basically it seems to be like he's all about speed.
Yeah.
And so that's really interesting that you brought that up, Andy.
I think Merleau probably has a better critique of this sort of technological innovation than Heidegger does in Being and Time. I haven't read The Question Concerning Technology, so it might be more in there. But I see no reason that Kurzweil or like Elon Musk or any of these other people who want to upload brains onto computers would have any problem with Heidegger, because for Heidegger, Dasein doesn't really have that much to do with physicality necessarily, right? And I think this gets into his whole section where he's talking about idealism. And I did not realize he was that explicit about it. His idealism, because that's been something that I've been thinking about throughout, how idealistic his thought is versus realist. And he goes out and says it very explicitly that he's an idealist.
He says no, he's not.
Well, he says, he admits that he's a very qualified idealist. I mean, if you take idealist as a sense of that you can never reduce the question of being to beings in general, then yeah, sure, he's an idealist in that sense, right? Only the meaning of being can be raised to Dasein, right, in that kind of idealist sense. But he's not saying something like, I'm gonna subscribe to some sort of epistemological project that frowns upon idealism in this kind of like traditional way, right?
Right, for sure. But I think that with it in mind that he is an idealist, it has the lived situation of the body is important for Dasein, but I don't think it's necessary for Dasein. So why couldn't Dasein be uploaded onto a computer? So I don't know if there's a critique there, but I think from the Virilio angle, there's a much better critique in the form of the accident. So the accident is this idea that humans can never control technology, that technology works independently from humans, and it always creates accidents that humans didn't plan on happening. So when we create the car or the highway, we also create the car accident with those things. Yeah. We also create climate change as a result of the Industrial Revolution, right? These technologies that we develop have accidents, and we never consider those accidents when we create the technology. And I think that's a much better critique of something like the singularity, because it suggests like we don't know what sort of accident this would bring about. And Virilio is also very much focused on death. And I don't know exactly how this would play into that, but he would probably say that at the point of the singularity, there's no life anymore. That it's already a social death.
And I only know that one argument from Virilio, and I think that you're right that it is a more potent or damning sort of argument against, these billionaires who want to save us all from what they perceive as our greatest threats, when in reality, the worse and worse threats that we keep facing are the ones being invented. And it's never like, it's always these accidents, right? But so to bring in the question concerning technology, because I think McLuhan, Heidegger, Virilio, and there's one other I'm forgetting. Make like a really excellent
Killer?
like you can compile their critiques really.
Luke. Maybe.
Luke?
No, Luke.
Oh, Luke. But in the question concerning technology, and this is, you know, so I promise there's a lot more to it, but I'm going to bastardize it here. The essence of technology is essentially that we challenge that the state of mind of dasein in the technological, the hyper technological age. There's a fundamental state of mind or attunement, an attunement to the world that reveals the world as a stockpile of resources, always on call for the fulfillment of our desires, right? And that was embedded in the proposition put forward by Bacon and Descartes in the first place. They said like, hey, let's do this for that reason. But the problem is that it folds over on us, because in order to raise up the infrastructure that's able to put the world on a platter, we all have to become cogs in that machine to the degree that we already have, right? So you want to be able to throw down some money and then get some thing that got, you know, mined from like, you know, 5 different countries and then assembled somewhere else. You throw down that money to get the thing. Yeah, but how did you get that money? You know, what systems of exploitation were in place that had you on call as a human resource, right? So every time we think we are gods, we realize how much more in servitude we are than we ever were before. And so you add to that, I mean, that's going to be one of the accidents, right? Is that unless we can figure out a way to break that chain of like increased slavery and exploitation.
Well, and the other thing is that if you think about how, I guess part of the technological advancement in that way is there's always a sort of, well, not always, but is everybody going to be able to have their consciousness uploaded to a computer, like everybody in the world? Okay, well, if not, then who gets to have that happen, right? Or like who gets to have access to the world on the supposed
platform? How does Trump get to live?
That's exactly what I was thinking when I was like, I want immortality.
Yeah, and so it's like, well, who are there going to be people on top who get to have the access to that, that amazing advancement? Like that's just inevitably how things work out.
I just realized what if imagine Trump, right? So, you know, getting to live for thousands of years, and the world becomes more and more totalitarian in order to lock us into this way of keeping that those systems alive, right? And I was just thinking about how profound J.K. Rowling is going to be. The Horcruxes will be they will be real, because he'll hide servers and backup, you know, data everywhere to keep himself alive, and you'll have to go like destroy them all.
Yeah. So one thing, just to kind of back up to what is Detroit?
Isaiah.
Yeah.
Oh, no,
so
Jacob.
One thing I kind of want to back up to what you were talking about when you were talking about dasein is not necessarily like physical bodies, and like maybe we might be assigning too much importance to physical bodies. And I think, I don't know, this is just my opinion, I think that's right. For me, the physical body isn't important as a physical body, it's important as a limit, right? Like, so dasein exists within certain limits, right? Which is why like God couldn't be dasein for me, right? And it's like, it's more than like, oh, well, God can't die, you know? Or, you know, God has a body or doesn't have a body. To me, it's more like God, if God were to exist, it would be an entity without limits, right? Like, and dasein has to reconcile and be aware of its own. I don't know, but maybe that's falling in that.
No, but I think that you're going to convince people who are sympathetic to your argument with that, but I don't think you're going to convince people who aren't sympathetic to your argument. You're not going to ever convince Ray Kurzweil that he's wrong by saying that human beings have a limit, right?
I agree, and that's what kept me up at night, right? It's like, this world is inevitable, and there's nothing I can do to stop it.
But everything that exists and anything that is created has limits. You know, even if something is, you know, really powerful and complex and powered by stars and lives for millions of years, I mean, the fact of the matter, is it's still finite. It's still contingent. So has limits, and that struggle for perpetuality or whatever you want to call it always gives that game away. That its existence is increasing the entropy of the universe, and that it is not ultimately in control of all of its, to put it in Heidegger's terms, cannot, no matter how powerful it is, cannot control all of its possibilities.
I was just thinking about how like the Greek pantheon of gods would be what all the billionaires become, right? Because they'll have, but the thing is they won't be limitless, and if they're not limitless and that possibility is still there, then dasein is still going to be there in some sense.
So I guess the world think about a world where you live forever. You have the ability to customize your environment through virtual reality. You have the ability to decide who you want to interact with, regardless of where they exist in history, because you can design a program to mimic that person perfectly, right? To me, a world without limits is a world where everything is customizable. And I don't necessarily think that's a good thing, right?
Possibility
is like open sandbox. Is that how they talk about it?
But and it seems like the whole push is to customize everything as much as possible. You customize depth, you customize your environment, you customize the temperature of the room that you're in, right? To me, that drive to customization is like a push to remove limits one at a time, right? And sometimes it'll create new limits, but then again, there's that push. Maybe I'm oversimplifying.
No, because control doesn't mean anything if there aren't limits. How do you even use the word control?
True. That's very true.
Control what? With what? How what? I never really thought about it like that, but the way that you said it just made me think it's like the whole concept of control falls apart when you lose limits.
I think what I'm saying is that limits are good, and we need them.
Well, right, and I would also, in support of that, say that's one of the things that is inherent within dasein is this a priori awareness of finitude, and the limits and and contingency, in tension with possibilities, some of which we're aware of and some of which we aren't, and we don't kind of know how that's also part of the hiddenness of dasein is we don't necessarily know all of our limits, and we don't necessarily know all of our possibilities either, and so there's not any way to and I think one of the things he's always trying to remind us of different ways is our being and our awareness of that, it can't ever be objectified. There's no way, because there's no place to stand to do that.
I thought it was really interesting that he said, okay, so the section on how I guess reality relies on dasein in a sense, but that doesn't mean it stops existing when dasein doesn't exist. That was on page 255. I guess, so something I was thinking about is how this idea of reality outside of human beings sort of presupposes an idea of God as dasein in a way, or of some being outside of and over and above humans that is somehow able to perceive it all and keep it all in being. Part of that Augustinian tradition is this belief that God keeps everything alive. Not like, I don't know.
Not just creates, but constantly sustains everything.
Fair or false.
And so there's this presumption that, well, there just has to be like a dasein of all daseins, or some like perceiving thing that by observing the world, or not observing, but by being the world, keeps it all going, right? And so if you question that ultimate perceiving being, I don't know, all sorts of ideas about objective reality sort of fall apart. I don't really know where I was going with that, but I thought it was really interesting.
What you're saying reminded me of the theologian Paul Tillich, where he talks about, the very possibility for there to be being presumes a ground of being which itself is not being or a being, which starts to sound like Heidegger. Well, he was German, right? There's something that you can't. There's something that makes being as we experience it possible, kind of, that we can't ever get to.
Right. It's the nothing, right?
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was saying it's the nothing. I feel like Heidegger gets into that in his later works. It's kind of difficult to understand, but there's another. I guess he thinks of himself as a sort of phenomenologist, Robert Corrington. He's got this system he calls ecstatic naturalism, but recently he's been really grappling with this idea of nothingness as the sort of originating ground of being, and what we even mean by nothingness. So yeah, and I think that you can find that in Heidegger too, and Corrington gets a lot of it from Heidegger's later work especially, but that's just a sort of an aside point.
Well, where the Greeks came from in this was their idea of chaos. Chaos was it was the kind of the absolute ground of potential being. The very fact that it was sort of disorder that couldn't be more disorderly, but out of that any kind of being could have rise. And when you try and start talking about chaos as a thing like that, you start running into the same kind of linguistic limits that you run into when you start trying to talk about nothingness and pure potentiality and things like that. Language falls apart because we can't experience those things. It's like the old joke: when you have any of nothing, you've got all of it. We're not able to how should we say? We're able to. We're pointing at something. I guess my question is, just like it's hard to say what we're pointing at when we're pointing at being, I think it's also at least similarly difficult to say what we're pointing at when we're pointing out nothingness, or when we're trying to point at whatever it is that makes being possible.
To me, it's whether it's the existential or the existential, it's the soup of primordial that he refers to, where there are truths. And I don't know, immutable laws of physics, things like that, chaos. Okay, however we bottle that up, there's this thing. There's this other thing, and we draw from it, but because we're dasein, we each have an unusual way of drawing from it and expressing it out to each other.
Totally. And I think that this is a good segue into what Jacob said about Heidegger being an idealist. And I think that this is something that we should, this whole section, so some people might not even made it that far, but I think it needs to be touched on at least. So when we get into truth and reality, and the real. And to tie this all together, I think I can. The thing is that, Paul Tillich, sure said that the background of beings would be something that's not their kind of being, and then says, well, therefore, then he can that's my place for Christian God, whatever that means to him, because he's a different kind of Christian than we would normally think, whatever that. But the thing is Heidegger leaves that space he doesn't care, and he's not going to go there. And so people can put something there if they want. They can anthropomorphize it if they want to, but because that kind of being wouldn't even have the kind of being that Dasein has as its mode of being, and because truth, as the primordial essence of truth is this revealing and concealing, the uncovering, the disclosure that Dasein does and is essential to its way of being. Because truth, the way that a scientist would use the idea of truth, or the way that people in epistemology will use truth, is derivative from that essential uncovering that Dasein does. Because it's derivative from that, he's going to say that the truth of the matter of whether things exist without us is nonsensical, basically. And I'm totally trying to just change the railroad tracks here and to paraphrase it before we get deeper. So please correct me if you have a better idea of what's going on here. I'm trying to just, but basically, I'm pretty sure that what he's doing, the reason he has to talk about truth as unconcealing primordially is to say that things, the objective reality exists without you. Or without Dasein, no longer makes any more sense once you understand that whatever people normally think of as truth is this derivative thing from Dasein. But at the same time, though, that he's not an idealist in the Berkeleyan sense, and he says that himself, because and for those who don't know, Berkeley would say that that it's literally all dependent on the mind of God. And that reality is being held in mind. So mind before matter, everything's founded on mind, and that we get to be pieces of that or whatever. But he's saying no. If Dasein ceased to be, then there would, he doesn't quite say that the tree would still fall in the forest. He just says no one would be there to hear it. So then there'd be no truth of the matter.
Right.
And without a truth of the matter, it's a nonsensical question.
I think
that makes sense. Does that go well with what you're reading of it? That's my question.
Yeah, but
I was just going to say.
sorry.
Oh no, we want to hear it. Just Andy's got to go pick up his girlfriend. So.
Yeah, sorry. What should I do with the? Yeah, thank you so much.
Later, Andy. Yeah, it was good having you, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me over. I'll see y'all next week.
Peace. I'll move.
Okay.
Sorry, Isaiah, you can go ahead.
Oh, I think there's just a little echo explanation.
I'm gonna head out too. Not everybody.
I did not hear the echo.
Oh, okay. So I was going to say something like, there has to be Dasein to care about the question at all, right? For there to be something like the raising of the issue of a tree falling in the forest, right? If Dasein isn't there, right? And nobody cares in that kind of way as raising that as an issue, right? There's no one there to raise that as an issue at all, the meaning of being, something like that, right? For something like a tree to be disclosed in that particular way, such that we care about it and such that we say something like, the tree fell in the forest, right? There requires Dasein to be there, right? And there's this kind of weird thing where he's saying something like, objective presence taken in that sense, where something exists outside of us, is on the one hand not dependent upon Dasein, but for that to be raised or disclosed at all as a mode of being, there requires Dasein in that way, right? So there's this kind of tension that I think he's playing with, right? But I think he's nevertheless, I don't know, how do I put it? I think he's still nevertheless trying to ride out this, I think you were bringing it up, which is essentially this ride out against this tradition that favors epistemology first over ontology. And what he's trying to do is something more in terms of this ontological project. And as much as the language sort of, the tradition especially, right, begets to more epistemological project, right, I think he's in the right direction to say something like, hey, look at this ontological project that we're getting here, and this kind of dissolves those problems, right? These problems are no longer raised in that traditional way because of how we can. The framework was the issue, right? And I think that's very profound, right? I think that takes a lot of philosophical depth to do. I think this is also goes back to someone like Nietzsche, where there's like, it's not just that you have to rise to the task of saying this problem, right? Here's the solution to the problem. This is why this problem doesn't matter philosophically, which is much more deeper than merely just building upon something. It's saying something like, here are where the questions really matter, which are ontological questions. And here are certain questions that are just not very interesting, right? And here's why. And I think that's like the most profound thing I think about this section, which I find so interesting, especially when he's talking about Kant, professed, right, Kantian lover.
Yeah, he says on page 251, the question has been formulated inappropriately. And like, he emphasizes that over and over again. And I agree, it's definitely a deeper analysis than just trying to, like, there's just some questions. This kind of reminds me of Thomas Kuhn, what is that book, the Scientific Revolution one?
Right.
The structure of scientific revolution.
Yeah, structure of scientific revolution, where it's like there's paradigms, all these questions within a paradigm, and not all of those questions get solved. A new paradigm is sort of opened up, and those other questions are now abandoned as irrelevant because they are with the new understanding of the world. So Heidegger is really a game changer in that sense. He's not trying to answer some of these questions. He's like, let's shift the paradigm here, and he really, I think, did in philosophy in the last century.
Oh no, Isaiah, please.
I talked a lot already. I just been holding on this thought about Merleau-Ponty because I wanted to raise it because I think that was his name. I haven't been here in a while, so his name Andy. Is that right? Yeah. So he raised the point about limits, and I think that's extremely important for someone like Merleau-Ponty. Actually, this comment I don't want to be like too dominating of the discussion, right? This comment was actually meant for Jacob and Andy. It was about, I was going to bring in Merleau-Ponty because I think his analysis about the body, right, is extremely important about both these questions about embodied cognition and also too about limits. Because what Merleau-Ponty is going to say is something like, in order for me to have a perspective and know the world, I need to be limited, right? Limitation is necessary, right, for me to know at all, for me to be at all in this way. And to make sense of something like a limitless or a perspectiveless, or something that has, something that's perspective from everywhere, actually doesn't make any sense and is completely incomprehensible, right? That doesn't make any sense, right? To have a perspective from everywhere is to have a perspective from nowhere, right? And so in this kind of way, I think Merleau-Ponty sort of furthers that sort of notion of a limit, and also secondly has that sort of notion of an embodied cognition that I think is important, that talks about something like the body and how that's so important for thinking about dasein in that way. I've been holding back. I mean, I try not to. Anyways.
Oh, that's great. And I think that you just said what anybody who's read Merleau-Ponty would say. And the only reason I didn't say it was because it felt like it'd be a little disingenuous on my part because I hadn't read it yet. But I totally think, for me, I just don't know how to. Yeah, I can't wait to read it. It's high on my list. I'm hoping to read it this year, actually. But as a Kantian though, and so maybe I can do this. I was thinking about how if you accept that human experience is the result of processes that are in part the human, relying on the human sensory organs that track things in time in a certain way, thinks in time in a certain span, and has categories that assimilate all the information in certain ways, then what we talk about as tree falling in the forest is totally this thing reliant on those structures. And that, so maybe the ant doesn't have dasein, and maybe the ant still climbs on said tree, but the ant has no experience of that tree as the human has experience of that tree. And these are all derivative. These, you know, so the human experience, you know, is derivative of Dasein. Dasein's existentiality in the first place. You know, the idea of the person is derivative of Dasein. The idea of the tree as present at hand is derivative from the tree as experienced as ready to hand, or environmentally, or circumspectively.
Yeah.
And I wonder about how Kant feeds into that. Because, I mean, the whole talk of categories, the filters, the assimilation of the data of experience to form experience seems totally Kantian to me. Right?
Did you want to say something, Sammy? I think you wanted to say something.
Well, I was going to say something, and then Dave pulled the word Kant out again, and it made me think. And because I wasn't thinking of Kant the whole time you were talking, Dave. In fact, like, well, but I mean, I think Kant was an important precursor to all of these sorts of ideas, and that's why he was so brilliant. He was another game changer, like, and paradigm shifter, because in a sense, because he really pulled things together in a way no one had thought of. And like that, the whole idea of categories sort of filtering our experience that are a priori, he didn't link it to the body necessarily, in the particularities of the body, but I mean, it's obvious, it's right there, you know, our eyes pick up this spectrum of light, right? And that's sort of an a priori condition of our experience. I was thinking actually of Nick Sustanis's Unflattening, which Dave and I read. I don't know if it was a couple years ago or last year, but it's really kind of a brilliant synthesis of all of these ideas in the form of a graphic novel. And there's just a section I'll never forget where it's a graphic novel that's a philosophical graphic novel. He's trying to genre bend. And there's a section where it's showing what a dog, like it's showing a dog going through the forest, and all the information the dog gets, the way the dog experiences the forest so completely differently because of its heightened sense of smell, you know, and how all of these different beings are going through this forest and they're all perceiving it in such different ways. And none of them are untrue, right? And they're all dependent on the way that sort of species has evolved over time and adapted to its environment. So yeah, yeah.
And the picture shows an awesome, like the picture, you know, speaks 1,000 words. I'm not going to try to here, but the dog has a different experience of time as well and possibilities because of that sense, that increased smell. You know, so it's not just, oh, I smell a chipmunk here. It's I smell a chipmunk here, you know, 5 minutes ago, and I smell a deer here 2 days ago. And so it's like, and then so it's not just possibilities, it's projecting on the future. It's also like these other kinds of possibilities, or no, like these, yeah, like the chipmunk is still, like, it's just in this other, complete other awareness, this other field of time experience itself because of
it's the awareness bubble.
Yeah, different awareness bubble.
It's the awareness bubble.
It would have a region of being, but it's a different kind of region of being.
Okay, so to go back to the Kantian question. So essentially, let me see if I can rephrase your question, if I got it correctly. You said, to what extent is Heidegger a Kantian in this way? Or to what extent is this question about Dasein, dependence and independence, etc., Kantian or influenced by Kant, right? Because of course he's giving a critique of Kant here, but at the same time, there seems to be things that are similar to Kant to a certain extent, right? So was that your question?
I'm actually not sure what my question was. That sounds, yeah. So, well, it was more like describing the way we collect that data. I'm using, you know, obviously like stupid terms here, but yeah, collecting the data of experience through those filters, assimilating a picture of the world through that process. That seems like a Kantian thing. and that I just don't know how it plays out with Kant in this chapter, especially with his critique of Kant. And does he say that Kant has a different conception of truth, or was it the real, or both? See, I'd have to go back to it. So really, I mean, I really meant to stumble around with words and then throw the ball into your court and see what you do with it. That's really all I really meant.
I mean, okay, so oh, sorry, go. Were you going to say something?
No, I just said Dave did a good job of that.
Okay, so I mean, there's several things we could talk about, right? So we could talk about how Heidegger says something like Kant just assumes this notion of truth, right? And I have a problem with the translation. The translation of knowledge should actually be, well, I mean, the original German is Erkenntnis, which is actually should be translated if you're talking about cognition, because usually knowledge means something like justified true belief, right? And it's usually true, right? So knowledge is true. But for Kant, knowledge, if you take that crappier translation, can either be true or false. True or falsity has nothing to do with knowledge, right? So that's why it's better to say something like, when he says knowledge in those passages where he quotes Kant, Heidegger, you actually should translate that to cognition, right? That's a whole other complicated field, but I just wanted to say that beforehand, right?
Oh, that's
so for Kant, right, specifically, Heidegger is going to say something like, Kant doesn't even talk about truth. He just assumes it. He just assumes the correspondence theory of truth, and it's not even raised as an issue, right? It's not even brought into his attention, right? But if you're asking this question about what you're talking about in terms of like, assimilating data and sort of thereby making sense of the world in terms of experience, what I would say to that is that Kant does that in terms of an epistemological project, right? He does that epistemologically by saying something like, here's a limit to cognition. Here's a limit to the human being, right? And so the human being is necessarily conceived as finite. And so due to its finitude, right, we can talk about objects in this kind of certain way. We can say something like, this object as it presents itself to me, right, is made up due to the categories and due to time and space in this way, right? And I can talk about myself in terms of my necessary structures, right? And that makes experience necessary and ordered in a particular way. That's why Kant wants to do that to begin with. Because if we ground knowledge in objects, then things are uncertain, right? Things are not grounded. If I ground things in my cognition, then I know my cognition, right? It structures experience in that way. So it's reversed. That's why you get the whole Copernican revolution, right? But for Heidegger, what he's going to do is something like, well, no, I mean, granted, yes, this project is important, right? And you show something about subjectivity in this way, right, where you're grounding things in the subject, right? But it's still Cartesian, right? He's still going to say that. He says that in the text itself. He says something like, Kant seems like he's doing something better than a Cartesian thing, but in actuality, he's still committed to this. He's still committed to the subject before the world, right? He's still committed to a subject that doesn't have a world, then creates its world. And this is a problem, right? And what Heidegger is going to say is, like, that epistemological project maybe showed certain things, right? Certain important things, right? But now I'm going to take that project from an epistemological standpoint to an ontological standpoint. And the issue of the world is no longer going to be this divorced thing where we think of a subject independent of a world. We're going to think of a subject sort of intertwined, right, with the world. And to think of anything else is to be incomprehensible, at least per Heidegger, right? It's going to be confused. When you say the world without a subject, no, that doesn't make any sense. We always are thrown into a world, right? That doesn't make any sense to say there's a world independent of us and the subject is here and here's the world, right? We can't access that. That's to say something that's only speculative in this kind of abstract way, right? And it's only coming out of philosophy in this kind of academic setting that would ever speculate about those things, right? And so I think that's why Heidegger he's saying, yes, Kant, you're doing things that are important regarding this move to the subject, right? But it's still nevertheless grounded in this Cartesian epistemology. And that's why this is wrong, right? And this is why we need to talk about this more primordial sort of sense of the world and the subject that leads to a better sense of what we mean by reality and by truth. So there you go. There's my rambling.
Well, I think that sounds spot on. And Heidegger also says that Kant, I guess, like, Kant presupposes the distinction between the in me and the outside of me, and also the connection between these. And then he's like, well, factically he's correct in doing so, but he's incorrect from the standpoint of the tendency of his proof. So like Kant has this presupposition of the connection between the outside and inside, and yeah, that's factically true, but from the sort of Cartesian commitments which Kant has, it doesn't work. So there's an inconsistency in Kant's argument, I guess. That's how I understood it. It was kind of a difficult.
I love how he's like, you know, so this correlation, is it the correlation? Not correlation, it's what's the other word? Correspondence theory. The correspondence theory of truth, you know, it's true if the thing matches up with, if the statement matches up with the thing that it's about, or the, you know, the state of affairs. And
chicken.
It's what?
But you can never know.
Right.
Oh, I thought you said chicken nuggets.
I thought you said that too, actually.
Okay, I could justify that one.
The chicken nuggets.
Chicken nuggets.
No, but I like how he says, you know, like he puts it in terms of agreement, right? You know, whether it agrees with it, you know, the statement agrees with the thing it's about, and then I love how he's just like, we haven't called into question, you know, we haven't asked though about what the being of this agreement is, and we also haven't asked about if the being of the things being in agreement is the same, and if it's analogous, and if it's analogous, then how so? Like, whoa, you just unpacked a lot of problems for the, you know,
correspondence, right?
Correspondence theory, yeah.
Well, it actually made me think of something I don't think I've ever thought of before, and also some of the previous comments here. I mean, you know, talking about, you know, the issue of, you know, epistemology, and that, you know, for Heidegger is trying to get people to see it's pointless to talk about, you know, a subject without a world. There is no subject without a world. You know, we can't conceive of that. You know, because whenever you are a subject, you're in that state of thrownness, right? Which means you're in a world. The thing I never thought about before is you sort of turn that around from the standpoint of the world. There's no such thing as a world without subjects, you know, and it works both ways, but it also then does something very strange with the whole question of, well, is there objective reality, you know, out there, you know, somewhere? And it's like, if your experience and your construction of the world, or your experience of thrownness, you know, and from your, you know, the corner of the world that you got thrown in, you know, your experience of the world is, you know, a certain way, and it's limited. It's this little slice of, you know, perspective and so on. And that's, you know, that's how, you know, it's out there. It can never be, you can never stand in some objective place where you can see it, where you can be freed from the particularities of your thrownness. There's no way to be, you can't be freed from that. So, you know, the other side of that is, since there is no world, you know, without those subjects, it's like you can't even. I think it clarifies, hopefully I'm taking this from Heidegger's perspective. I think it clarifies from his point of view why the whole question of, you know, objective reality, or, you know, a world, you know, apart from the subject, or the subject apart from the world, is simply the wrong question. You know, it's incoherent. It's ultimately it's incomprehensible. You know, because the subject is never without the particularities of their perspective, and the world is never without subjects that have limits and boundaries and all of those things. So there's no matter how you orient yourself, there's no way to get to any kind of objective position. In fact, the idea is simply, I would argue, ultimately it's contradictory, paradoxical.
Totally, and I think he says that that right at this point that you're at, rather than say rather than just be like the question dissolves. One of the traditional responses has been to say you can't question it without presupposing it, and he's like, what does he say in response to that? I wanted to just pull it up. Unless anyone else remembers off the top of their head.
Are you saying about the thing about faith and how you presuppose a faith in the world?
250. Yeah.
Yeah, right. That's still cashing out in epistemological terms, right? Because you're still going to use faith as an epistemological term. You're going to say, well, we don't have knowledge of the external world in this kind of way. You're just going to assume it in terms of faith. But that still assumes in principle that you could prove the external world, right? If you just had the way by which to do it. And you're still cashing out in this epistemological framework. And that framework is terrible. At least that's what Heidegger wants to say, right?
Right, and I love how he puts it on 249, the whole page, he's addressing responses, which he doesn't normally, you have to give him credit. He doesn't normally do this. He's built up this much of the book just so that he can take a sledgehammer to these kinds of arguments and say, so he spends the whole page being like, well, someone might say that. Well, sometimes he will say this. Sometimes he will say that. And then on the next page, he's just like, faith, prove, presuppose. All three of those arguments or ways of trying to stave off some question, a question that's epistemological, therefore presumes my ontology. And by the way, I love how I just said he smashes it with a sledgehammer. And I believe it was chapter 1, maybe chapter 2, when he says that we will destroy the Cartesian ontology. And he also says like explode it at some, he uses some word like explode. And then he does his go-to example for readiness to hand, the thing that precedes precedes all of the present at hand stuff and the presence ontology stuff that the epistemologists are always stuck in, is with a hammer. So he's always using the hammer as his demonstrative tool. Right. And the thing is that he's a huge time Nietzschean, and Nietzsche prophesied that there would be a philosopher to come who would philosophize with a hammer.
You know what happens when you got a hammer.
Yeah, he talks about the hammer a lot. That's
and there's a part where he says, with an obstruction, you can do this, you can do that, or you can smash it to pieces.
I just imagine him walking around his cabin in the Black Forest, just holding the hammer, just all lit up.
The hammer and the sickle. When you're talking about this, it made me think of something that I read recently that was kind of like one of those, in my reading of things, it was like a well, duh moment, but is in the biological environmental world is this adherence recently to the notion of trophic cascades, which is where a whole ecological system is dependent on predator and prey. And if you change any one piece in it, the cascading effects can be total annihilation, or a whole species goes extinct. And they're just finally getting around where now it's a word, and they've got a term for it. And it's like, well, duh. I mean, it seems to me like if you read other things that were far in advance of that, it's like, that's a fairly obvious phenomenon. I think that's what Heidegger speaks to in that, the truth, the primordialness, is this whole notion that, it's a moot point to pretend that there's a world where we're not in it and we can't hear the tree fall. who cares? You know, it's the same, that Cartesian mentality that said, oh, we can eliminate all the salmon in the world and it won't affect anything.
Yeah, no, totally.
And now we're starting to find out, gosh, it may affect everything for the entire northern hemisphere.
Right, and the question concerning technologies is it plays off the idea that, you know, the Cartesian move was to render the world as world of objects for for subjects, us, and to consume. But then as we systematized that and snapped it all to the grid, the sciences, puts it all in a grid and then makes it accessible through the technical sciences and the technology that comes from that. It renders those, it liquidates those objects into resources, whether they're not liquidated yet or not. The system is always in the process of thinking in terms of liquidizing the resources, the objects. And what you're getting at, a part of what you're getting at is like how it clearly doesn't understand, you know, that way of thinking doesn't think in terms of ecology whatsoever, right? And how this is definitely like you know, the turn of the 20th century, early 20th century, beginning thinking in the laying the ontological basis for any kind of ecological understanding.
Well, I think that's what Detroit was trying to get across there, was, you know, the movement from epistemological to, I can't even remember the big words. Okay, lots of points there for big words. I don't remember them now. But the epistemological versus ontological. Okay, is it? Yeah, no. And I think that what I was trying to relate to is that many of our allied fields of study beyond philosophy, okay, are just now starting to realize that interdisciplinary interdependentness of things, where it makes it a moot point. Who cares if you can't hear a tree fall in the forest because you're not there? You know, that's the wrong question.
I care.
Yeah.
So something that I think is important to talk about is actually this notion of truth that he's going to get at, which I think goes along with all of these things that he's saying, especially the things about concerning technology, is he's going to say something like technology or the technological framework conceals the truth of things, right? It actually conceals it, right? Usually we want to think of science as getting to the real, as getting to the atoms that make up reality. Right, but in actuality, right, at least for Heidegger, he's going to say something like, rather, right, we're concealing as they appear in themselves, right, and we're concealing it, overlapping it by this technological framework by saying something like, when I see a mine, I don't just see a mine, I see a mine for resources to exploit, right, and that itself, right, the danger that comes from that isn't that, right, that we do that. The danger comes from the fact that we fail to recognize that we do that, and we fail to recognize our technological framework as a framework to begin with, right? So we take this technological framework as truth, as that, you know, in the typical sort of grand scientific sense of truth, as the really real, right? And so what Heidegger wants to show is something like, well, no, in actuality, you're concealing, right, the truth of the matter, right, by ignoring this more fundamental way of engaging things, which is before this technological framework, right? And so I think that's, I don't know, it's fundamentally, I think, important to think about, I think, ecological questions in this kind of way, right, with Heidegger, right? Because I think it opens a space to think about how to engage the world and nature, right, with an eye to this, what he calls enframing. I think you called it attunement earlier or something like that, right? I forgot the German word. I think
calling framing and attunement, which would be the better definition for state of mind here in chapter 5, actually.
Yeah, no, I mean, so in the Joan Stombaugh edition, it has attunement, right? Is it the same word? Because I think the German word is like Gestell, right? Or something like that. I don't remember.
That's framing for sure, at least.
Yeah, right. And framing is Gestell, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Wait, so you're saying in the Stombaugh translation, state of mind is attunement? Yes. Yeah, and that, and just to clarify it, it's not So yes, seeing the world as objects and subjects is true in the sense that we normally mean true. Seeing using the world as resources, still true, but in the actual primordial grounds of what we normally mean when I was just saying true, is aletheia, which is revealing, concealing, and that kind of truth always hides as it shows, and we can always just think of Wittgenstein's rabbit bunny. So there's a Gestalt shift that has to happen in order to see the rabbit as a bunny. But then after you see it as a bunny, then you can't see it as a rabbit, and you can only think of it as one way. But what science is doing is it's snapping everything to its grid of intelligibility that renders it as resources. Thus, our entire world picture is fundamentally, it's like we've gone around compiling bunnies when there's a bunch of rabbits still there. And ducks. There's a bunch of ducks still there, but we're compiling the bunny picture. They're still there though, right? And so it's like, yeah, there's this more fundamental understanding, but the answer is not just romanticism. And even though he says poiesis is something towards this solution, the answer is not just romanticism or poetry, because you can go to the coffee shop and write poetry, or you can go to you go and you buy one of those chocolate bars that saves an endangered species. But the problem is when you bought that coffee or that chocolate bar, that money is bestand credit. If you've read Question Concerning Technology, bestand being the stockpile of resources. That money operates as that credit for those resources that have you on call within that totalized system. So it's just like, you can be poetic about the mountain outside, but at the same time, at the most real level of your daily living and the things that you consume and the ways that your average everydayness below the conscious level, that mountain is not what you're writing poetry about. That mountain is ultimately a stockpile of resources. So it's not something you can just say, oh, but I'm an environmentalist as opposed to dirty capitalists.
Yeah. And the famous quote where Heidegger says that only a God could save us, or something like that. I think there are a lot of ways of approaching the problem that Heidegger overlooked because of his fundamentally anti or non-political nature and nature of his work. But I think it is really important to acknowledge that point you made just now, Dave, that it's not in framing itself that is the enemy, that's something that needs to be eliminated, but we need to be aware that there are other things that are, I guess, being cut out of our framework or being hidden. And those things need to be brought into unconcealment. And I think that's sort of a pathway towards, not necessarily a solution, but towards something better than what we have now. Because, and that's sort of where poiesis comes in, is it's like, that's a way of unconcealing an aspect that is covered over by the technological way of looking at things. But it's not the only aspect besides that sort of resource-oriented mentality. There's other aspects, and I think, I guess part of what I see as my life work or the life work of people post Heidegger and post all of these other philosophers who have really helped us elucidate what the problem is we have to figure out what those aspects are that we need to, and I don't know, be attuned to them, I guess. And yeah, I don't really know where I was going with that. I was agreeing with you.
I gotta go.
Yeah, you're missing a party, aren't you?
No, I'm missing.
I've got to go. I think we've all. It's 9 o'clock, so it's a good time. Does anyone have any closing thoughts before we sign off?
I like the picture on the wall hanging askew, and the whole discussion of truth that comes along with that. To me, that because I'm obsessive compulsive, and there's an order in my life that says pictures have to be damn straight. What were you thinking? And there are other people who could possibly care less. And both statements are true. And the picture and being askew on the wall relates to a whole set of values. And I turn around and I confirm that the picture's hanging crooked on the wall. Askew. Okay. Askew. I like the choice of the word askew.
Doesn't have the same value.
No, right. And versus being crooked on the wall, because maybe the artist perceived the piece to be crooked on the wall. But in this case, askew means that it's out of order. I like that description. That helped me a lot.
Isaiah asked if you have a new time to meet Division 2.
Oh.
Hello?
So wait. Isaiah was just bringing up something that I had written down here that I forgot to bring up. And yeah, so there's been talk about the possibility. Well, we should raise for a conversation. Okay, we have different people here now than we did at the beginning. Newer people have come on board, and some people have moved on with other things, and therefore, and also, some people have got new jobs. Some people have quit other jobs. So the things have moved around, and so this time is harder for some people now than it was, and it might be other times might be easier for everybody. And it's just a question to put forward. And I don't know what the best way of proceeding. I kind of want to just put that out there. But seeing as this is the end of Division 1, and we kind of know who's on with this now, it's probably, a good time to raise it. So like, for instance, so I remember Wednesday worked for you, for instance, before. Do other days work for you?
Wait, who's talking right now? Sorry.
Well, I asked Brian a question. Now he's just looking at me.
Oh, you glitched. I didn't realize you were talking. Wednesdays work, Thursdays work, Saturdays work. Actually, Saturday would be pretty rad. I could do pretty much any time on a Saturday.
Okay, so and Wednesday would be the same time block as today. Saturday seems pretty movable. And obviously we're going to want to consult with everybody who's looking to be on board for Division 2. This is really just getting the skeleton of the doodle poll in mind, right? Whether we use the doodle poll or just confirm via messaging. But, for instance, Lydia said that she was going to have trouble doing this all summer, and then she hasn't been able to be on for the last 2 weeks. And she said something last week, but not this week. So I'll get into contact with her and see how things are going over there on that end, and I'll do that with everyone who's still on board. But does anyone else here right now have any more feedback on those days?
I definitely can't do Wednesdays. Tuesdays or
Wednesdays are not preferable for me. I could do it, but
sounds like a Thursday, Saturday poll might be in order, and that the poll might have different times on the Saturday, but the same times on the Thursday.
Yeah.
So good to everyone else.
Sounds good.
Yep.
Es ist gut. All right, everybody. As they say in Thailand, Kap Kun Kap. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day or an evening.
Bye, everybody.
Night. Night.
Bye.